General Audience number 23 of April 2nd, 1980. Matthew and Mark report the answer Christ gave to the Pharisees when they asked him about the indissolubility of marriage, appealing to the law of Moses that allowed in certain cases the practice of the so-called certificate of divorce. Reminding them of the first chapters of Genesis, Christ answered, "Have you not read that from the beginning the Creator created the male and female and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and his mother and unite with his wife, and the two will be one flesh'? So it is that they are no longer two, but one single flesh. Therefore what God has joined, let man not separate." After this, addressing their question about the law of Moses, Christ added, "Because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so." Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 8, and Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 9. In his answer, Christ appealed twice to the beginning, and thus we too, in the course of our analyses, have attempted to clarify as deeply as possible the meaning of this beginning, which is the first inheritance of every human being in the world, man and woman, the first witness of human identity, according to the revealed word, the first source of the certainty of his vocation as a person created in the image of God himself. Christ's answer has a historical meaning, but not only a historical one. Human beings of all times raise the question about the same topic. The same is true about our contemporaries, who in their questions do not, however, appeal to the law of Moses that allowed the certificate of divorce, but to other circumstances and other laws. Their questions are charged with problems unknown to the interlocutors at the time of Christ. We know what sort of questions about marriage and the family were addressed to the last council, to Pope Paul VI, and are continuously being formulated in the post-conciliar period, day after day, in the most varied circumstances. They are asked by single persons, by married and engaged couples, by young people, but also by writers, journalists, politicians, economists, demographers, and some by contemporary culture and civilization. I think that among the answers that Christ would give to the people of our times and to their questions, often so impatient, fundamental, would still be the one he gave to the Pharisees. In answering these questions, Christ would appeal first of all to the beginning. He would perhaps do so all the more decidedly and essentially, inasmuch as man's inner and simultaneously cultural situation seems to move away from that beginning and assume forms and dimensions that diverge from the biblical image of the beginning, to points that are evidently ever more distant. At any rate, Christ would not be surprised by any of these situations. And I suppose that he would continue to refer above all to the beginning. This is the reason why Christ's answer called for a particularly deep analysis. In fact, this answer recalled fundamental and elementary truths about the human being as man and woman. Through this answer, we gain insight into the very structure of human identity in the dimensions of the mystery of creation and, at the same time, in the perspective of the mystery of redemption. Without this answer, one cannot build a theological anthropology and, in its context, a theology of the body, from which also the fully Christian vision of marriage and the family originates. Paul VI pointed this out in his encyclical dedicated to the problems of marriage and responsible procreation from the human and Christian point of view when he appealed to the integral vision of man. Paul VI, Humanae Vitae 7. One can say that in the answer to the Pharisees, Christ laid out before his interlocutors also this integral vision of man, without which no adequate answer can be given to the questions connected with marriage and procreation. Precisely this integral vision of man must be built from the beginning. This point is valid for the contemporary mentality just as it was, though in a different way for Christ's interlocutors. We are, in fact, the children of an age in which, due to the development of various disciplines, this integral vision of man can easily be rejected and replaced by many partial conceptions that dwell on one or another aspect of the compositum humanum, but do not reach man's integrum, or leave it outside their field of vision. Various cultural tendencies then insert themselves here that are based on these partial truths, and on this basis make their proposals and practical suggestions for human behavior, and even more so, about ways relating to man. Man then becomes more an object of certain technologies that the responsible subject of his own action. It is also the aim of Christ's answer to the Pharisees that man, male and female, be such a subject, that is, a subject who decides his own actions in the light of the integral truth about himself, inasmuch as it is the original or fundamental truth of authentically human experiences. This is the truth Christ makes us seek from the beginning. It is in this way that we turn to the first chapters of Genesis. The study of these chapters, perhaps more than others, makes us conscious of the significance and necessity of the theology of the body. The beginning tells us relatively little about the human body, in the naturalistic and contemporary sense of the word. From this point of view, we find ourselves in this study on a wholly pre-scientific level. We know almost nothing about the inner structures and regularities that reign in the human organism. Nevertheless, at the same time, perhaps exactly because the text is so ancient, the truth that is important for the integral vision of man reveals itself in a simpler and fuller way. This truth concerns the meaning of the human body in the structure of the personal subject. The reflection about these ancient texts allows us, as a next step, to extend this meaning to the whole sphere of human intersubjectivity, especially in the perennial relationship between man and woman. In this reflection, we gain a vantage point that we must necessarily place at the basis of the whole contemporary science about human sexuality in the biophysiological sense. This is not to say that we must give up this science or deprive ourselves of its results. On the contrary, if these results are to be useful in teaching us something about the education of man in his masculinity and femininity, and about the sphere of marriage and procreation, we must always arrive, through all the single elements of contemporary science, at what is fundamental and essentially personal, both in every individual, man and woman, and in their reciprocal relations. And it is exactly here that reflection on the ancient text of Genesis proves to be irreplaceable. It constitutes really the beginning of the theology of the body. The fact that theology also includes the body should not astonish or surprise anyone who is conscious of the mystery and reality of the incarnation. Through the fact that the Word of God became flesh, the body entered theology, that is, the science that has divinity for its object. I would say, through the main door. The incarnation and the redemption that flows from it has also become the definitive source of the sacramentality of marriage, which we will deal with more extensively at a suitable time. The questions raised by contemporary man are also those of Christians, of those who prepare for the sacrament of marriage, or of those who already live in marriage, which is the sacrament of the church. These are not only the questions of the sciences, but even more so the questions of human life. So many human beings and so many Christians search in marriage for the fulfillment of their vocation. So many want to find in it the way of salvation and holiness. For them, the answer Christ gave to the Pharisees, who were filled with zeal for the Old Testament, is particularly important. Those who seek the fulfillment of their own human and Christian vocation in marriage are called first of all to make of this theology of the body, whose beginning we find in the first chapters of Genesis, the content of their lives and behavior. In fact, on the road of this vocation, how indispensable is a deepened consciousness of the meaning of the body and its masculinity and femininity. How necessary is an accurate consciousness of the spousal meaning of the body, of its generative meaning, given that all that forms the content of the life of the spouses must always find its full and personal dimension in shared life and behavior, in feelings. And this all the more against the background of a civilization that remains under the pressure of a materialistic and utilitarian way of thinking and evaluating. Contemporary biophysiology can offer much precise information about human sexuality. Nevertheless, the knowledge of the personal dignity of the human body and of sex must still be drawn from other sources. A particular source is God's own Word, which contains the revelation of the body. The revelation that goes back to the beginning. How significant is it that in his answer to all these questions, Christ orders man to return in some way to the threshold of his theological history. He orders him to place himself at the boundary between original innocence, happiness, and the inheritance of the first fall. By doing so, does he not want to say that the way on which he leads man, male and female, in the sacrament of marriage, namely, the way of the redemption of the body, must consist in retrieving this dignity, in which the true meaning of the human body, its meaning as personal and of communion, is fulfilled at the same time. For now we conclude the first part of our meditations, devoted to this subject, which is so important. To give a more thorough answer to our questions, at times anxious questions about marriage, or still more exactly, about the meaning of the body, we cannot dwell only on Christ's answer to the Pharisees, in which he appeals to the beginning. We must take into consideration all his other statements, among which two stand out in a special way as having a particularly rich meaning. The first, from the Sermon on the Mount, on the possibilities of the human heart with respect to the concupiscence of the body. And the second, when Jesus appealed to the future resurrection. We intend to make these two statements the object of our following reflections.